Welcome to the Journal Editorial Report. I'm Paul Gigot. Senate Republicans released a revised version of their health care bill this week, hoping to jumpstart their stalled effort to repeal and replace Obamacare. President Trump urging members of his party to get it done, saying the time to act is now.
I am sitting in the Oval Office with a pen in hand, waiting for our senators to give it to me. For years, they've been talking about repeal, replace, repeal, replace. Now we have a president that's waiting to sign it. I have pen in hand.
So will changes to the bill be enough to get moderate Republican holdouts on board? Let's ask Wall Street Journal columnist and deputy editor Dan Henninger, assistant editorial page editor James Freeman, and editorial board member Joe Rago. So, Joe, the bill has changed for the better or worse, and how?
Well, I would say both. This is a bill that's moved to the political center. It's moved leftward. It's worse in the sense that it gets rid of a lot of the tax. It keeps a lot of the tax increases on investment income, 3.8 percentage points
that were part of Obamacare.
They were part of Obamacare.
That Republicans promised to repeal.
They did for years, and it spends that money on other stuff. It's got $45 billion for opioid treatment. It's got a lot more upfront Medicaid spending. It's good and better in the sense that it retains the fundamental Medicaid reform. That's really the most important part of this bill, moving to a per capita block grant.
To the states from the federal government.
Right. A lot of devolution to the states and putting the program on a budget for the first time since 1965. It's a structural reform, which is the only way to rationalize the entitlement state.
So that still is the part, in your view, that is really worth passing this bill.
It's worth passing for that reason. The new bill also adds something from Senator Ted Cruz. It's called the freedom option. It's a lot of deregulation that will start to potentially bring down premiums in the individual market. That's the type of progress that we need to stand up a more liquid, richer insurance market with more options and more competition.
But this isn't the root and branch repeal of Obamacare that they promised. It's a compromise. It's sort of a, let's try to please all sides of the Republican coalition.
I guess so, Paul. I think I have a little grimmer view of it. I mean, at the end of the day, what did the solution come down to? Something very familiar in Washington. Throw more money at it, right? That's kind of what it came down to. More money because those the so-called moderate centrist senators, and so the Rob Portman of Ohio, Mr. Cassidy of Louisiana, these other people wanted more money for Paul, opioids and Medicaid. We thought that people like Rob Portman and Senator Cassidy from Louisiana could be called conservatives. I think this is really a moment of reckoning for the Republican Party, because what we're finding out is that a lot of these Republican senators really are not conservative as the way we thought the party had evolved. A lot of them are acting like big government Republicans back from the 1970s. And what we saw was that when they got pushed by the left and by the media, they caved, and they were sort of running from the party of Reagan. So I think the conservatives, whether they actually represent Republican and conservative voters is another question. But this behavior on this bill suggests to me that the Republican Party has to step back and think a little bit about what they stand for. Well, and there's one senator who's already said he's not even going to vote to a motion to proceed, and that's Rand Paul of Kentucky. He's not a moderate, he's a libertarian. Why would he blow up this bill? And if this fails, James, you get Obamacare.
Yeah, and I think Republicans who vote against it also deserve primary challenges, because the United States government has unfunded liabilities in the tens of trillions or perhaps the hundreds of trillions. This is one little baby step toward reforming the fastest growing entitlement program,
which is Medicaid.
There's good evidence that you're no healthier with Medicaid than if you have no insurance at all. It's not working for anyone. And the idea that you can't begin to reform it to have money spent better, it boggles the mind that Republicans can say no to this opportunity.
And Joe, the Cruz option, which I happen to like being part of the bill, was that going to help with some of the conservatives?
Yeah, you've already started to see Senator Cruz, who'd been calling this Obamacare light, start to come on. Ron Johnson from Wisconsin, maybe Mike Lee from Utah. So it's started tried to assuage them. They've sort of given up some of their reservations about this bill. As you said, it's not root and branch reform, but it's a net improvement and directional progress.
But you think it's actually a pretty important reform?
I think it's a pretty important reform. What James is talking about with Medicaid, this bill saves $772 billion over 10 years. Now, look, that's not
and
enough.
Even more as you go out.
Right,
if the law doesn't change.
It's a structural reform that makes changes over the long term. That's the type of change we need in Washington.
All right, so here's just step back and look at the politics. Republicans in the Senate in 2018 have one senator in a tough race, Dean Heller of Nevada. One.
Right.
Everybody else is generally pretty safe. They're 18 months from that election. One senator, and if they can't make this pass right now with that kind of a limited vulnerability politically 18 months from now, when will they ever pass any reform of entitlements?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, because what the Republican voters and the American electorate did was give them control of the government. After allowing the Democrats to control it, they passed the Affordable Care Act, they passed Dodd-Frank, and there was obviously disaffection with both of those big pieces of legislation. Now it was the Republicans' chance, as they promised when they got control of the government, to revise these, go and fix these things, and they're not pulling it off.
All right, thank you. We'll see this. It's going to be a historic week. When we come back, President Trump's oldest son being pulled into the Russia probe after taking a meeting with a Russian lawyer during the 2016 campaign. But is it proof of collusion? Our panel weighs in next. The president's oldest son now being drawn into the investigation into Russia's interference in the 2016 election. Donald Trump Jr. released emails earlier this week from 2016 showing that he agreed to meet with someone he believed to be a Russian government attorney after receiving an email from a publicist offering him information that would incriminate Democratic presidential nominee Hillary Clinton. President Trump defended his son Thursday during his trip to Paris.
I have a son who's a great young man. He's a fine person. He took a meeting with a lawyer from Russia. It lasted for a very short period, and nothing came of the meeting. And I think it's a meeting that most people in politics probably would have taken.
All right, Dan. So people say this finally proves that there is collusion. There was collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. How do you see it?
I don't think any serious Washington lawyer would agree with that there is collusion, an actionable act that could be taken to a prosecutor and prosecuted. But look, the media has had this narrative from the beginning that there was collusion. They're going to chase it to the ends of the earth. Let's try to talk a little bit about what happened here. He met with these people to talk about opposition research, OPPO as we call it. OPPO research happens in every campaign. Do campaigns meet with individuals from foreign governments? Yes, they have done that. Are there dirty tricks in politics? Yes, there is that. But the difference here is that we know that the Russians did hack into the election, into servers.
Right.
There's been congressional testimony that they tried to hack into 20 state election systems as well. That is what is new here. And so Donald Trump Jr. has walked up to the line with the Russians where these two intersections meet. And that's why the prosecutors are now going to take a hard look at what this meeting was about.
But the email, the come on email was, look, this is part of, we have dirt on the Clinton campaign, and we have also think that this is representing the support from the Russian government for the Trump campaign. And Donald Trump Jr. said, I love it.
Yeah.
So that suggests that he was happy to, he didn't object to help from the Russian government. This is a government that is not our friend.
Right. And in a normal campaign, you've got the candidate, the people right below him. That would include Donald Trump Jr. If you get a request like that, you send somebody who's about 5 or 6 layers below that to go talk to them and see if they have anything. And then they talk to the lawyers in the campaign who say, get away from these people. But no, the Trumps took it on themselves.
He even roped in Jared Kushner, the son-in-law, and Paul Manafort, the Beltway lobbyist who represents a lot of unseemly foreign clients. So, I mean, at a minimum, it's stupidity, incompetence, in my humble opinion. But, I mean, yeah, it's hard to defend.
It is hard to defend. I think there's certainly a lot of people in Washington would like to get information, and you don't want to say it's illegal to gather information. But yeah, I think more seasoned political pros, maybe more classier, shall we say, politicians might have at least wanted to keep more distance from this kind of meeting. But this kind of brings up the choice that people had last year, two very flawed candidates. And you look at what's happening here. We're a year into the collusion investigation. So far, nothing showing the Trump campaign actually doing anything.
Well, wait a minute. This meeting isn't anything. It did something. They met.
Well, okay, a meeting, but I mean, in terms of colluding, in terms of working together to rig an election, which is the charge.
In terms of saying, okay, we have an idea. We're going to hack the Democratic National Committee. Good idea.
Right,
okay?
that would be collusion.
That we don't have any evidence of. On the other hand, if they say, we've got some dirt on the Clintons, come and meet with us, and go, great. I mean, that's not really very good politics.
It's distasteful, and we're seeing really the initial stages of learning about what happened. Where did this whole collusion theme come from? It looks like it may have come from Democratic-funded opposition research seeking from Russian sources.
This is a so-called dossier that was created.
Information on Donald Trump.
That has been discredited.
Well, so the question is, we seem to have two campaigns last year, or at least two parties, that were willing to take dirt on their opponents from foreign sources.
But here's the thing. There's only one president right now, not Hillary Clinton. It's Donald Trump. He won. All right? There's a special counsel looking into this regarding the Trump campaign. How much legal jeopardy is there here, Joe?
Well, I suppose it depends on the underlying merits of the case. Donald Trump Jr. showed terrible judgment here in taking this meeting. But the question is, did it ever advance into anything that was not only unsavory and reflects poorly on the Trump family business, but into something that's potentially criminal? We don't know that. We don't know this. The Russian lawyer he met with was apparently arguing against the Magnitsky Act, which was a law that sanctioned, American law that sanctioned Russian human rights abusers. It looks like potentially a cutout to lobby to weaken this law, but still, other than the email, nothing of substance seems to have come out of this.
So far, okay, and that's the question, Dan. I mean, they issued incomplete account of this when it first came out, and that's part of the problem. They released the emails 2 or 3 days later, which I'm glad they did it. Let's get it all out. But that's the sort of thing, instead of just trying to say, oh, well, this is just a meeting about adoption, the Magnitsky Act related to adoption, they didn't get the truth out.
They didn't get the truth out. And so now what this ensures, as you were suggesting earlier, is that the special counsel, Robert Mueller, and the lawyers who are working for him are going to overturn and look into everything related to this campaign and the Trump people who were involved with it. Jared Kushner, Manafort, the president himself. They're going to want to look at all their emails. They're going to look at all the documents, all the phone records. That's the way these investigations work. And all of them are going to become preoccupied with this. Jared Kushner has had to hire his own lawyer, and it is just inevitable that it's going to preoccupy them.
All right, when we come back, while the White House deals with its latest Russia headache, Congress seems to be creating one of their own as a new Russia sanctions bill stalls in the House. So what's the holdup all about? While the White House is facing fresh questions about Russia's role in the 2016 campaign, Congress is bogged down in a debate over just how much authority to give President Trump to potentially ease sanctions against Moscow. The Senate overwhelmingly passed a bill last month to impose new penalties on Russia and to make sure the administration can't change course without congressional approval. But that measure has stalled in the House. So what's behind the holdup? Let's ask Tennessee Senator Bob Corker. He's the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. So welcome, Mr. Chairman. Glad to have you here. Let me ask you first about the meeting that Donald Trump Jr. had with the Russian during the campaign. Do you agree with President Trump that anybody would have taken this meeting?
Well, Paul, good to be with you first. Let me just say, look, we have these daily drippings out of what has occurred during the campaign. I just want to fall back on the fact we've got a Senate Intel Committee that's going through this. They'll be able to put all this in proper context. Personally, had I received a call from about some Russian official wanting to give me information, I would have said no. But look, I think the Intel Committee can put all this in context. If I responded to these on a daily basis, Paul, I wouldn't be able to deal with the policy issues that we have to deal with. So I just think we ought to let them go through all this, and at the end, we'll have everything in proper context.
All right, let's talk about that policy. The Russia sanctions passed the Senate 98-2. That's Republicans and Senate and Democrats don't agree on much these days. Why the overwhelming support for this bill? Why the bipartisan support for this legislation?
I think that, first of all, there had been concerns early on that maybe some cheap deal would be made with Russia over Syria that would eliminate the sanctions on Crimea and eastern Ukraine, or the sanctions relative to what Russia did there. In addition to that, the cyber issues, we want to make sure that we push back against all those who are involved in the cyber issues. As Russia continues to privatize state-owned enterprises, we want to make sure that those who were through corruption unfairly benefiting for that, we punished. We want to make sure those who were supplying arms to Assad were punished. We want to make sure those who were doing business with certain intel agencies and defense agencies within Russia were punished. And I just think there's an overwhelming on both sides of the aisle, and I will say candidly among national security folks within the Trump administration, a desire to push back against what Russia has done. And I strongly support this bill. Obviously, I think the House will take it up very soon.
Okay, so on the sanctions provision, you got the additional sanctions, and you go to then the White House says, oh, we support the sanctions, but what we want is more presidential flexibility, and they don't like the fact that your bill denies the president the flexibility to ease sanctions if he comes to some agreement with the Russians. And now in the past, Democrats have insisted that Barack Obama have that kind of flexibility. Why not give it to this president in this case?
Well, if you remember, Paul, we had this same problem come up with Iran, where President Obama was able. He was able to go straight to the UN Security Council, lift all the sanctions that Congress had put in place for 8 years, which was not Congress's intention. And so I'm the one that's been leading the effort to ensure that we have congressional review. Had this provision been in place, the Iran deal, that I think was a terrible deal for our nation, would have never been put in place. And so this is us asserting our rightful equal role in foreign policy, and I'm all supportive. I'm very supportive of congressional review. I feel like I've led the charge on that, and it will be a part of this bill.
So
when it comes out of the House. It will be a part of the bill when it comes out of the House, no question.
What if the House doesn't include it? Because the White House is pressuring the House not to include it. And it comes back to you guys.
It's going to come out with congressional review from the House. I get no sense whatsoever that they plan to change it. I've been on the phone just in the last 30 minutes with Ed Royce. I've talked to leaders on both sides of the aisle there. This bill will come back to us, I'm absolutely convinced, with congressional review. It's the right place for us to be, and it will stay.
All right, there's one other question, obvious, that we wrote about this week, which is the oil companies are objecting that the way the Senate bill is written, it could block American investments, not just in Russia, but anywhere around the world, if there was just a small bit of Russian participation in Brazil or Nigeria. Do you willing to get that fixed?
Yeah, you and I have talked about it, and Ben Cardin and I, my Democratic counterpart, did a colloquy on the Senate floor to resolve this issue. I've talked to OFAC at Treasury about this issue, and I think they could fix it with colloquy, but McCarthy's staff has been over to see us about it. And as you know, it's about bidding on grids out in the ocean, and the United States and U.S. company could bid on a grid out there and win, and right beside it could be a Russian entity. A lot of time governments say, hey, we want y'all to form a consortium so that we have one pipeline that's bringing that oil back, and that is an issue. It's a legitimate issue, and the House can either solve it through a legislative text change, which I've talked to Steny Hoyer about. He's in agreement with that. Or they could do it through colloquy, but it's a legitimate issue.
But you're willing to fix that? Sounds like it's going to be fixable.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right.
Absolutely. All right. And Senator Cardin on the Democratic side and the Senate is too.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. Still ahead, Mitch McConnell cuts the Senate's summer vacation short as the GOP scrambles to knot some legislative wins. A look at what this Republican Congress has achieved in its first 7 months and what it still needs to do to satisfy voters ahead of the 2018 midterms.
Due to this unprecedented level of obstruction that we've been experiencing, we will be in session the first 2 weeks of August.
If I were them, I wouldn't want to go home and face the voters either.
Blaming obstruction by Democrats, Majority Leader Mitch McConnell canceled almost half of the Senate's August recess this week, saying he'll keep lawmakers in Washington in order to give Congress more time to make progress on President Trump's agenda. In addition to repealing and replacing Obamacare, passing a budget, and beginning work on tax reform are at the top of the to-do list. But Mr. McConnell also hopes to push through the backlog of more than 100 presidential nominees who have yet to be confirmed by the Senate. We're back with Dan Henninger, Joe Rago, and James Freeman. So, James, let's take a step back here for a second as they approach the August recess, 7 months, almost 8 into this, well, I guess it's 7 into the presidency. Typically a time when a new Congress, a new government with the same party running both sides of Pennsylvania Avenue gets a lot done. Right. What do they have to show for it so far?
Well, not by the traditional measures, maybe not much. We think of Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid putting a huge $800 billion stimulus on Barack Obama's desk within a month. That hasn't really happened here. But if you're a Trump voter reflecting on your choice, you can say there's a great Supreme Court edition in Neil Gorsuch. You can talk about a burgeoning rollback of federal regulation, Congressional Review Act bills. A lot of them have gone to the president's desk.
How many? 13, I think. Is that it? Something like that? 13 of them?
13. So these are basically rescinding rules from the Obama era. President Obama was the greatest regulator in history, measured by pages in the Federal Register. So there is a good start here, but the big agenda items are still hanging out, and that's, we talked about health care, and it's the big tax cut that I think a lot of workers, investors, really everybody who wants a faster growing economy is still waiting for.
You know, but there's also, Joe, the sort of the smaller bills that some of these new governments, Congresses put together. They really haven't done too many of those. There's one on the Veterans Affairs.
Yeah, there's one on the VA. There's some on FDA, on the Food and Drug Administration. But there's a lot of stuff that's passed the House and hasn't gotten through the Senate. Right. So typically a bottleneck on Capitol Hill. But I think you kind of have to look at this and be disappointed in what they've done so far. Really not the kind of progress that traditionally happens.
And there are two big reasons here, Dan. One is, I think, that healthcare choice that they made to go with healthcare first has just proven to be a lot harder than they thought. First in the House, it took longer. Now it's approaching a moment of truth in the Senate. But also, Democrats have really just done everything they can to slow the Senate down, particularly on nominations. How bad is it?
Well, it's very bad on nominations. I mean, there are many, many important seats in the government that have not been fulfilled. I came in with a little bit of a list. They're just about to start moving. The U.S. Ambassador to Japan, Bill Hagerty, the Solicitor General, Noel Francisco, many undersecretaries and deputy secretaries, Kevin Hassett, who's going to be chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, David Malpass, undersecretary for international finance. These are very important positions that have not been fulfilled for 7 months.
But Chuck Schumer's response would be, well, they got so far behind the Trump administration in nominating them. What do you expect? It's their fault, not ours.
Ambassador Hagerty was nominated back in February. Some of these people have been sitting for 6 months, and these are nominations that are not controversial. The thing here, though, Paul, is there's a new reality in Chuck Schumer's opposition. The Democrats are simply not participating in the government. Now, in fairness, the Republicans in Obama's first term did not participate in the passage of the Affordable Care Act or Dodd-Frank. So that suggests, as I was saying earlier, that if you get control of the government, as these Republican senators have now, you have to make a concerted effort to get some things done while you have those votes. That's what they're not doing.
And what Schumer's done is he's used every tool, procedural tool, in the Senate to stretch out to these nominations. So they have a 30-hour rule of debate. I think they're stretching that out. When Harry Reid had cut a deal with Republicans, limiting it to 8 hours on any nominee, they're stretching everything out. They're denying hearings under an arcane Senate rule. Republicans, what do they do about it, James?
Well, I think they may go further to change the rules. We saw how Chuck Schumer, the Democrats, basically put up the goal line stand against Neil Gorsuch. Bad move. He was a blue chip nominee. Should not have been a big fight about that. That ended up killing the filibuster for judicial nominees going forward. So I think normally the Senate, a lot of it runs on unanimous consent.
Right.
And that's how they waive all of these complicated rules that basically prevent anything from happening. If the Democrats are saying, no, we're going to insist on the rules that prevent anything from happening, I think Republicans will naturally look at what other rules ought to be rewritten.
Let's assume health care passes this month, Joe, in the Senate, and they move on and it gets House and Senate pass it before the end of the recess. Can they finish tax reform by the end of this year?
Well, it's going to be hard. I mean, tax reform, I think, is in a lot of ways, it's going to be harder than health care reform. The thing that will help is a sense of urgency. This has been so difficult on health care. I think this is a Congress that knows that they and the Trump administration are going to be judged on economic results, on their performance, and that might speed things along, sort of tamp down some of these divisive debates.
It's really do or die on tax reform, especially if they can't pass health care. All right, still ahead, Iraq's prime minister declares victory over Islamic State in Mosul. But is the war against the terror group really coming to an end? What the U.S. needs to do to avoid repeating past mistakes. Next. Iraqi Prime Minister Haidar al-Abadi declared victory this week over the Islamic State in Mosul, where the terror group declared its so-called caliphate in 2014. But after a bloody 3-year struggle there, my next guest says the fight is far from over. Seth Jones is the director of the International Security and Defense Policy Center at the RAND Corporation and author of Waging Insurgent Warfare: Lessons from the Viet Cong to the Islamic State. So Seth Jones, welcome. Good to have you here.
Great to be on. Thanks, Paul.
So how significant for American interests, we know it matters a lot to the Iraqis, but how significant for American strategic interests is this liberation of Mosul?
Well, I do think it's important, and I think it is important to note that the U.S. strategy changed quite a bit in the 2003, 4, 5 period, and all the way up through the surge. The U.S. did a chunk of this kind of clearing with U.S. Marine or Army forces. In this case, the U.S. supported Iraqi counterterrorism forces, Kurdish militia, and unfortunately some Shia in the area. So it was done much better, I think, this time.
So why do you say unfortunately some Shia? Because that's really Iranian front groups and militias.
Yeah, well, and the number of Iranian, the amount of Iranian support here and the number of Shia militia in Iraq is staggering right now. Almost 150,000 popular mobilization units. That's pretty significant. It actually shows how much influence Iran has in Iraq right now.
All right. Well, now the campaign against Islamic State also making progress inside Syria, where the fall of Raqqa, their headquarters in Syria, could also be heading that way. Is that victory, that liberation, imminent too?
It's probably not imminent. I think if the liberation of Mosul tells us anything, it's Raqqa and some of the villages and cities that sit south along the Euphrates River Valley are going to be brutal fights. They're going to be filled with car bombs, suicide bombers, children that are being used as shields in the fighting. I think it's likely to be intense. But I think in the end, the Americans are likely to prevail with their local allies and remove most of ISIS from these towns and villages, including Raqqa. Okay, so let's assume that liberation does take place. You've written for us this week that already the jihadists from Islamic State are spreading out, returning essentially to their insurgent strategy, blending into villages, smaller towns, waiting for another opportunity to regroup, and no doubt committing terror along the way. What has to happen on the part of the Iraqi government and the U.S. to make sure that ISIS doesn't revive? Well, I think at the core, we have to remember that this is primarily, it's a political struggle going on, not a military one. And if we look at some of the Anbar cities like Fallujah and Ramadi, Fallujah was cleared by the U.S. in 2003.
Right.
Then we had insurgents move back, it was re-cleared. The last decade and a half has been constantly re-clearing some of these cities. So I think what has to happen is, in particular in Sunni areas, some of the key issues that have disenfranchised Sunnis have got to be better addressed. That is in part a heavy political effort by the U.S. and U.S. diplomats to push the Iraqi government. This is going to put it really at loggerheads with Iran to settle some of these Sunni disenfranchisement issues, and that is the large number of Shia militia, more rapid reconstruction in cities like Fallujah, now Mosul and Ramadi, and then to treat this as a political rather than just a military struggle.
So they can't seem to be, the Baghdad government with the Shiite forces that back Iran can't seem to be imposing a new kind of tyranny on those Sunni areas of Anbar province in Iraq, because that's the root, that's the base from which the insurgency grows.
That's an important base of support. If one looks at the rise of the Islamic State in 2014, certainly its ability to gain sanctuary in Syria was helpful, but also its ability to take advantage of grievances among the Sunni population, who identified their government in Baghdad as essentially an Iranian stooge, was a key component of ISIS actually getting into that area.
All right, so what would be your recommendation to the Trump administration about how to handle U.S. forces there? We've got several thousand that are on the ground there, mostly special forces, advisors, and targeters. But should we negotiate a more permanent presence there of the troops, 10,000 or so, of the kind that President Obama refused to do in 2011?
Yeah, I think there's no question right now the U.S. Needs to recognize that Iraq does have a strategic importance for the United States. I don't think it requires a large number of U.S. conventional forces,
right,
but I do think it does require the U.S. to remain and have access to Iraqi bases, to continue to train Iraq's counterterrorism service, which was incredibly important in the retaking of Mosul and will be in the retaking of other cities, including Al-Qaim in Iraq, to continue to train Iraqi police forces, which will be the bedrock for law enforcement in Fallujah and Ramadi and other Sunni heavy cities in the future. So those are some of the key issues, and to keep trying to push out and then demobilize some of the Shia militia forces operating in the country right now, which I think is really counterproductive for U.S. interests.
Well, so in a way, it's a counterforce, would be a counterforce, at least politically, not militarily, politically, to Iranian influence in Iraq. And I assume maybe a balancing role politically. You've got the Kurds in the north, you've got the Shiites in the south and the east, and then you have the Sunnis. So there's a kind of a political balancing role here, too.
Yeah, I think there is a clear political balancing role. The Kurds in the north have generally been pretty effective over the long run in taking care of their own security. I think the balance there is a growing interest in broader Kurdish independence, linking up with Kurdish units in Syria and Turkey. Slightly different struggle than the Sunni fight down in Anbar. So there are multiple political issues the U.S. is going to have to balance.
All right. Thank you very much, Seth Jones, for being here. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Paul.
When we come back, the so-called summer of hell has started for New York area commuters as long-needed repairs divert tens of thousands of riders from the nation's busiest rail hub. A look at what's behind the rising costs and mounting delays in infrastructure projects across the country. Next.
New bike?
Yeah, because I got
Allstate. If you total your